So, now there's still a few minutes for questions. 5 minutes, in fact, before it's 3 o'clock. We've actually finished on time. and let me just say, there was one gentleman here who I didn't, I'm not sure is here anymore, but there was one gentleman who asked a question and basically saying, well, look, given that there are all sorts of things happening all around us, to what extent don't we just simply speak the gospel and not try and prove it, or not try and enhance it in some way? We should just speak it. Now, I'm sympathetic with that. I'm not unsympathetic with that. But I do think that in order to communicate, you do need to know the measure of the person that you are talking to. Okay? So, whilst it's perfectly true that you can just simply say, this is the good news, this is what God says, tough. You can do that. I'm much more of the view that standing in the shoes of the other is an important part. So when Paul says that he argues in the marketplace, he argues with people, when he says that he's all things to all men, that is what I think he means, that he stands in their shoes. What does it look like when you have someone who's not a Christian and who believes certain things? What does that actually look like then from their perspective? And so I do think that although you can say bluntly, and sometimes you have to say it bluntly when there's no other recourse, I think there is some wisdom in loving a person by standing in their shoes. So I would want to say, yes, you know, okay, you can be blunt, but if you want to be effective, then really relationally standing in their shoes is probably a much easier way to communicate and engage with them in some particular way. So that would be my answer to that one. But I'm happy to take some more questions if there are some. Sir?
You talked about Jesus' willingness.
Yep.
And I think that's a wonderful truth to bring in. And I wonder if Philippians 2 would also apply to go further back in his willingness, where he didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but willingly came down to become a human being,
Sure.
become a servant.
Sure. Yes, and more than that, he knew that he would be the Lamb before the creation of the world. And so there is a sense that this discussion was already had already taken place, that as Creator, he would nevertheless take it upon himself to be that willing substitution. What I'm trying to avoid is turning it into simply, as it often has been preached, merely a penal kind of retribution for God's wrath and all these other things. The reason I'm doing it this way is to get people to walk with me into what Jesus actually did. What he did was to say yes, willingly, to have his death by Roman execution to count on our behalf deeply. That is wonderful. You know, whereas we, the wrath that's postulated in chapter 6 is now, he says, I'll take that upon myself on behalf of ourselves. Now, I think that's wonderful. And I'm trying to lean in that direction because I want people to see, particularly in a modern culture, that this is true love. This is true love. You know, Jesus himself says that. Oh, you might die for a good man, perhaps, but the reality is, that while we were sinners, he died for us in sin. I've emphasised this because I think it adds a layer of warmth to it, which I think is so important in our culture. Remember, we're in an affective domain. So therefore, we have to speak in an effective way as well, in the affective domain as well. And I think preaching Christ's willing sacrifices, appealing to the affective reality in all of us, that Jesus has been immensely kind to us. He's been immensely kind to us. and appease the wrath of his fathers, to be sure. But the reality is that there's a kindness in that, a willingness in that. He didn't have it taken away from him, but he gave it, in fact. And that is a kind of, it shifts it in the direction of where people are in terms of, how they start their thinking. Now, it's not the whole story, and you can keep going, right? I'm not arguing that. But what I'm saying is I'm trying to embrace where people are, to draw them in to understand that this is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And then, to see it in a much bigger picture, of course. There is much more, and I'm not suggesting that there isn't. But you have to stand in someone else's shoes in order to begin to, where they are. You can say, well, too bad, I don't like that, I want to do it this way. Well, okay, you can do it that way. But if you do it that way, then please understand that that's not going to be as effective as actually understanding where people are, where the battle is raging, in fact. So, if people are struggling in the affective domain, then you start there, not to stay there, but to join to that the cognitive domain, to put the both together. So we are Christians because it's true, but we're also Christians because God cares for us. It's a double thing. It's not one versus the other. I think that's too shallow. We have both of these things. That's how I would want to see it. Where both of these things are true. Any more questions?
Frank, more of a statement.
Yep.
If we accept the fact that the sacrifice of Jesus was a willingness on his part,
yep,
it makes the statement celebrating the Lord's Supper so much more deeper.
I agree with that.
Because how can we celebrate a death?
Yeah, that's right.
But if
That's
we
right.
celebrate his willingness.
Sure. That's what I've been trying to do in the church that I'm part of, to get people to see that there's something tremendous in this. That it isn't simply, God needed somebody and it happened to be Jesus and we'll get rid of Jesus, and that will suddenly pay all the debts. You can say it like that, but I think you've lost something of the willingness of Jesus, of his own choices and his own freedom. And when the army appears at the end, when he's arrested, and Jesus draws the sword and tends to, wants to defend his master in a sort of gallantry way, and he says to Peter, put it away. Can't I call 10,000 angels? He could just do that if he wanted to, but he didn't. But he could. And even in the Garden of Gethsemane, that he was praying, and they all fell asleep, but he was praying. And the same idea, if this could be taken away from me, I wouldn't mind that, but not my will, yours be done, you see. And they'd already agreed before the creation of the world, in fact, that he was going to do that. He was called the Lamb before the creation of the world.
If it was only a penal substitution,
Yeah.
he would have only just appeared on the day and gone to the cross, and that would have been it.
Yeah. The execution, and I always called it an execution, right? Because it was a Roman execution. And it was the greatest victory for Satan, in one sense. He'd argued with Jesus earlier on in the desert, but I'll give you all these things. You see? No, it wasn't going to be. The rabbis, not the rabbis, the Pharisees, the Jewish authorities colluded with the Roman government and executed him. A great victory for Satan, just like the fall of Adam and Eve was a great victory for Satan. But it's turned around on itself. The very victory suddenly becomes, this will count for my people. And so Satan loses. You see? There's a whole story to that. And if you see it as a historical flow as well, then you begin to realise that it's very powerful. Okay. Well, it is. I find it extremely powerful. So. Go ahead.
You're right in what you're saying. It's that pre-creation collaboration
Yep.
within the Godhead.
Yes.
And as it says in Corinthians chapter 2, that it was a mystery,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
had the powers and the principalities known
Yeah.
that the atonement was going to take place, they would not have put him on the cross, right? So there was this great collaboration before the creation. In a sense, it's like if you make something and you have the foreknowledge to see that something's going to go wrong, you put into place this mitigating circumstances to redeem that situation rather than to wipe it out.
Yeah.
And that is probably why God did not start again, because the plan was already there
Yeah.
before the creation. That
Oh, yeah.
when this happens, this is what we're going to do. And that is Jesus said in Mark, he set his face resolutely
Yep.
to go to
Yep.
Jerusalem.
Yeah. It's.
This is a point that a lot of people miss.
Yeah. I agree.
Collaboration.
I totally agree. But there's another aspect of it, which is some of you have had children, some of you have had sons and daughters, and unless you're not normal, there would have been times that things would not have been the way you would wanted them to have been. Now, I don't know about you, but I can certainly think of my children in that particular direction. So, what do you do when your sons and daughters don't actually perform the way that you would like them to perform, take up opportunities, blah, 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 all the issues? Do you go and say, well, I gave you life, I'll kill you? You hear parents sometimes talking about their children in that way. I feel like killing them. The thing is, you don't do it. Why? Because you love them. And God is in exactly the same boat. He creates a real reality. There is a real seduction by spiritual force or by Satan of humanity. God doesn't like it. He sees what the world is like, but he doesn't wipe it out. In fact, he does what we all try and do with our children who are off the rails, so to speak. We try and help them back onto the rails. And that's exactly what God has done. That's exactly what he's done. To the high cost of accepting the willing sacrifice of his own son. It's remarkable, in fact. You see, it's absolutely remarkable. That's what he's done. So, count me in. As I often say to audiences, this is not rocket science. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see this. It's marvellous, in fact. It's really marvellous. And in a sense, we've gone for a day about thoughtful Christianity. I've put the case at the beginning for the fact that God is, and that there's plenty of questions that are answered by the existence of God. I've tried to characterise the culture that we live in with all its problems, with the fact that nevertheless it's like a book with pages missing but enough left to ask the question, how does all this work together? And I've emphasise the importance of the Bible, not only in the flow of our culture and the loss of the centrality of the Bible, and the fact the Bible fits those bits in the spine of the book. And lastly, I've looked at some of the problems that people see with the good news, and I've tackled a number of problems, including, if God is good, why is there so much evil? And lastly, the enormously willing sacrifice of Jesus. I think I've covered a lot of ground. So thank you.